Georg Ludwig, known to history as George the first Hanoverian king of Great Britain and Ireland. His journey is full of unexpected twists, scandalous rumors, political maneuvering, and enduring cultural impacts that shaped a dynasty. Despite not speaking English and often appearing distant to his British subjects, George I laid the groundwork for a new era in British governance and royal succession. In many ways, his personal story feels like something straight out of a modern political thriller. Alliances, betrayals, conquests, heartbreak, and an unrelenting quest to secure a legacy. So buckle up, because we are about to unravel the life of King George I in a way you might never have heard before. On May 28, 1660, in Hanover, then a part of the sprawling Holy Roman Empire, which controlled large swathes of Central Europe. This was no small backwater region. Hanover was a key political territory ruled by the House of Brunswick-Lüneburg, or more commonly, the House of Hanover. Into this politically charged environment, Georg Ludwig arrived as the eldest son of Ernst August, Elector of Hanover, and Sophia of the Palatinate. Now, if the Palatinate name doesn't ring a bell, it's important to note that Sophia was a granddaughter of King James I of England. This genealogical detail would, in a roundabout way, put George in line for the British throne, a line of succession that wasn't at all obvious in his youth. But let's not jump too far ahead just yet. As a child, little Georg Ludwig grew up surrounded by the protocols of a powerful German princely court. He was raised amid the formalities of the Holy Roman Empire, where political alliances were carefully nurtured, and an individual's social standing was often predicated on how well they navigated the labyrinth of aristocratic relationships. From an early age, George was taught the fundamentals of military command, political strategy, and the complexities of ruling a territory in Europe's patchwork of states. He learned French and Latin, both essential court languages at the time, and even picked up a bit of English, though he never gained real fluency. By teenage years, George was already taking part in campaigns, such as the Franco-Dutch War, acquiring battlefield experience that shaped him into a disciplined and practical leader. His upbringing was far from the comforting environment of a future British monarch in Westminster or Windsor. Instead, George's cultural background was thoroughly German, and he leaned heavily on that identity throughout his life. Tales of him inspecting troops, discussing strategy with generals, and focusing on the well-being of Hanover's army were common. Indeed, from the vantage point of many people in Hanover, the prince was expected to become a formidable ruler in his own domain, continuing his father's legacy and possibly forging new alliances with neighboring principalities. At the time, few even considered the possibility that Georg Ludwig would someday relocate permanently to an island across the Channel and ascend a throne that had historically been occupied by the House of Stuart. Like most aristocrats of the era, George's marriage was more about political maneuvering than romantic courtship. In 1682, at the age of 22, he married Sophia Dorothea of Shelley. The motivation behind this union was clear. It was meant to strengthen ties between two branches of the House of Brunswick-Lüneburg. Yet from the start, the marriage was marred by tension. George was notoriously reserved and could appear cold, while Sophia Dorothea was rumored to have a more fiery temperament and strong emotional needs that simply weren't met by her husband. Rumors soon emerged that George had taken various mistresses, most notably Melusine von der Schulenburg, further straining any hope of marital harmony. This was not entirely unusual in aristocratic households of the time, but it did lead to great friction, especially given Sophia Dorothea's own suspected infidelity. The marriage produced two children, George Augustus, born in 1683, and Sophia Dorothea, born in 1687. The future George II, George Augustus, would go on to clash violently with his father's style of parenting and ruling, but more on that later. The daughter, Sophia Dorothea, eventually married into the Prussian royal family, becoming queen in Prussia, further entangling the Hanoverians in European power relations. For a brief while, it seemed as though George and Sophia Dorothea had done their duty. They had a male heir to carry on the family name and preserve the lineage. But any illusions of domestic stability shattered when rumors of adultery escalated to something far more explosive. By 1694, things had reached a breaking point. Sophia Dorothea was accused of having an affair with Swedish Count Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, a scandal that rocked the courts of northern Germany. Legend has it that von Königsmarck was either killed or went missing under mysterious circumstances, prompting whispers that George himself had a hand in orchestrating, or, at the very least, allowing the final blow to fall. The official record is murky. Some say Königsmarck was assassinated, others argue he disappeared. But what is clear is that this event gave George the impetus to divorce Sophia Dorothea and confine her to the castle of Ahlden for the remainder of her days. She spent over 3 decades in captivity, dying in 1726, essentially banished from polite society. This dramatic episode fueled rumors that George was both ruthless and unfeeling in his personal dealings. He never remarried, choosing instead to openly continue his relationship with Melusine, whom he later honored with British peerages when he became king. The entire saga would follow George as a dark cloud, haunting him long after he crossed the Channel to claim the crown of Great Britain. Meanwhile, in 1698, George's life took another big turn. His father, Ernst August, died, leaving George as the new Elector of Hanover. This position was no small matter. The Holy Roman Emperor recognized certain German princes as electors, meaning they had a formal role in electing the emperor. This made Hanover a powerful region in the empire and gave George a bigger say in continental politics. For years, he juggled alliances with other European states, participated in the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, against France, and worked tirelessly to elevate the status of Hanover, sometimes overshadowing his own personal inclinations. George was a soldier at heart. He believed in discipline. He trusted in the chain of command, and he maintained a strategic mind when it came to forging or dissolving alliances. Enter the stroke of fate that would change his life forever, the English Act of Settlement of 1701. Designed by the Parliament to ensure that the English throne remained Protestant, the act placed George's mother, Sophia, of the Palatinate, in line for succession to the British crown after Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs who was a Protestant. This happened because other closer Stuart heirs had either died or converted to Catholicism, rendering them ineligible under the laws that barred Catholics from the throne. When Sophia died mere weeks before Queen Anne in 1714, the baton of succession passed to her eldest son, Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover. When Queen Anne died on August 1st, 1714, George was officially proclaimed King George I of Great Britain and Ireland. He was 54 years old, a middle-aged German prince suddenly thrust into the role of reigning over the English, Scottish, and Irish realms. His personal feelings about this dramatic shift are less documented, but one can only imagine the mixture of triumph, apprehension, and perhaps even reluctance. After all, he barely spoke a word of English and had strong attachments to Hanover, but the rules of succession were the rules, and George set off for his new kingdom, escorted by an entourage of German courtiers. The arrival of George I in Britain wasn't exactly the kind of triumphant, charismatic event that one might imagine for a new king. He was reserved. The British public was suspicious. Here was a monarch who struggled to communicate in their language and clearly preferred the music, culture, and traditions of his native Hanover. He also brought along Melusine von der Schulenburg, conferring upon her such lofty English titles as the Duchess of Kendal, which sparked further disapproval among the British aristocracy. Yet none of these personal details could overshadow the larger constitutional implications of his accession. Because George wasn't proficient in English and spent so much time away from London, he delegated a great deal of political authority to his ministers, most notably Robert Walpole. Walpole's role would grow to such importance that he's now widely considered the first de facto prime minister of Great Britain. But let's not mistake George I for a mere puppet. He was deliberate in whom he trusted and how he allowed them to govern on his behalf. He was also unafraid to assert his will when he deemed it necessary, particularly in foreign affairs that involved Hanover's interests. This tension between his role as King of Great Britain and Elector of Hanover would be a defining feature of his reign. Many English subjects felt he cared more about the well-being of Hanover than that of Great Britain, fueling the notion that George was a foreign king who might never truly understand them. Pamphlets and newspapers of the time printed cartoons depicting George speaking gibberish or ignoring Parliament in favor of secret talks with his German advisors. This criticism formed a part of the comedic tradition of British satire, and the newly expanding press had a field day with it. Within a year of George taking the throne, a significant threat to his claim arose: the Jacobite uprising of 1715. The Jacobites wanted the restoration of the Stuart line, championing James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, who was Queen Anne's half-brother and the Catholic son of the deposed King James II. Large swaths of Scottish and some English territories sympathized with the Stuarts, hoping to overturn the Act of Settlement and push out George. The Jacobite rebellion was swiftly quashed at the Battle of Preston in 1715, thereby solidifying George's authority. But the conflict left deeper fault lines in the social and political landscape, especially in Scotland, where grievances against the Union and the Hanoverian monarchy would persist and resurface over time. Yet for all the drama that accompanied the early years of George's reign, there were also some significant leaps in the British government structure. Because George didn't want to be front and center in British politics, plus his language barrier made it tough for him to engage in complex parliamentary debates, a delicate balancing act occurred, giving far more influence to ministers like Walpole. This arrangement let George focus on continental strategies, forging alliances to keep France in check, ensuring the security of Hanover, and preventing any Catholic restoration attempts in Britain. In effect, a more robust parliamentary system began to take shape. The seeds of constitutional monarchy, which we recognize in Britain today, sprouted in this era. Ministers, rather than the king, started taking the lead on policy making, ensuring that the monarchy worked in closer tandem with Parliament than ever before. It would be an oversight to ignore the major scandal that rocked the financial world in 1720, the South Sea Bubble. The South Sea Company had promised enormous profits from trade in South America, but stock speculation soared to unsustainable heights. When the bubble burst, countless investors, both aristocrats and common folks, found themselves ruined. George I's own involvement was hotly debated, as rumors suggested that he and Melusine might have sold their stock early, benefiting from insider information. Though never definitively proven, these whispers damaged his reputation, painting him as a monarch with questionable loyalty to his new kingdom's financial well-being. Once again, Robert Walpole swooped in, reorganizing the government's debts, restoring at least some measure of financial stability, and thereby bolstering his own position as an indispensable leader in George's administration. The fiasco cast a long shadow, but it also underscored how central the prime minister's role had become in mediating between the monarchy and public crisis. All the while, George's personal life continued to be fodder for gossip. Even though he had locked his ex-wife, Sophia Dorothea, away in the castle of Ahlden, and she remained there until her death in 1726, rumors persisted that he harbored a cold resentment toward her. Some claimed that behind the stoic exterior lurked deep anger, while others argued he simply wanted to forget that chapter of his life. Meanwhile, Melusine enjoyed a favored position at his court, receiving lavish gifts and titles. But this was not the only family drama. George's relationship with his son, George Augustus, was legendarily fractious. The younger George found his father insufferably aloof and controlling, while George I viewed his son as impulsive and disloyal. In 1717, the tension boiled over in a series of disputes, culminating in George I expelling George Augustus and his wife, Caroline of Ansbach, from St. James's Palace. The elder George kept his grandchildren close, almost as hostages, to maintain some control over the line of succession, and presumably to ensure his son towed the line. This father-son feud became a public spectacle. People spoke of a court within a court, as George Augustus held parallel gatherings at Leicester House, cultivating his own supporters who opposed the policies of his father. The tension between the two George was a soap opera in slow motion, playing out over years and shaping the tone of the monarchy. Despite, or perhaps because of, his frequent absences from Britain, George I left an indelible mark on the cultural scene. He was a patron of the arts, especially music. One of the most famous beneficiaries of his patronage was the composer George Friedrich Handel, who had ties to both Hanover and London. The story goes that Handel composed his water music suite for King George III, first performed on barges along the River Thames in 1717. The event has since become a legendary example of Baroque grandeur, bridging the taste of a German-born monarch and the pomp of London's social calendar. Handel would later create masterpieces like Messiah, further establishing London as a cultural capital. So in a sense, George I's support for Handel indirectly boosted England's musical reputation on the European stage. For all his limitations in dealing with Parliament, the king's championing of the arts left a lasting cultural footprint. His foreign policy achievements are also noteworthy. Having been an elector of Hanover, George I placed a high premium on balancing power in Europe, particularly to check French ambitions. Britain under George joined the Quadruple Alliance with France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Dutch Republic to curb Spanish power in the War of the Quadruple Alliance, 1718-1720. Diplomacy can be a messy business, but George's alliances and treaties, including the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, and the Treaty of Hanover, 1716, showcased his commitment to maintaining a delicate equilibrium that would keep both Britain and Hanover safe from expansionist threats. Critics, however, contended that his zeal for alliances was primarily aimed at preserving Hanover's interests rather than focusing on English or Scottish needs. As time wore on, George traveled often back to Hanover, sometimes spending months away from Britain, leaving ministers in charge at home. This pattern of absentee kingship fueled discontent among the British public. Satires portrayed him as an absent landlord who merely collected taxes from his new realm while tending to his old. Still, Ironically, this was precisely the environment in which Robert Walpole and the parliamentary system could further solidify their roles. The monarchy more or less became a stabilizing figurehead for a political system run increasingly by a cabinet of ministers. Without fully realizing it, George I's personal preferences laid the groundwork for a modern British monarchy that reigns but does not always directly rule. By the mid-1720s, George I was pushing into his 60s, an impressive age by the standards of the time, especially for a man who had lived his life straddling political conflicts. He had consolidated power in Britain, weathered the Jacobite threats, survived the ignominy of the South Sea bubble, and overshadowed personal scandals involving his ex-wife and his mistress. Indeed, he may not have ever been warmly embraced by his English subjects. Many criticized him for keeping a largely German-speaking entourage, for failing to truly integrate, and for his stilted public appearances, but he had held the monarchy firmly within the Protestant line, as the Act of Settlement intended. It was in June 1727, during one of his return journeys to Hanover, that fate caught up with George I. While in Osnabrück, he suffered a stroke and died on June 11th. He was 67 years old. According to some accounts, he was found slumped by a roadside, but official reports are sparse. What we know is that he never made it back to Britain. His body was taken to Hanover and laid to rest. The crown he left behind passed to his son, now George II, a man who, ironically, had spent much of his life at odds with his father, but would go on to continue and even deepen many of the political changes that had begun under George I. In the immediate aftermath of George I's death, many in Britain seemed more relieved than grieved. Whig politicians recognized that they still had a comfortable foothold in government, especially with the new king. A wave of pamphlets and letters circulated, some praising George I for maintaining stability, others condemning him as an aloof foreign ruler who never truly cared for his British subjects. Yet over the centuries, historians have revisited George I's reign with a more nuanced lens, crediting him for helping usher in the constitutional developments that would shape modern Britain. In the end, George I's story is one of contradictions. He was a man of discipline and practicality in war and politics, yet tumultuous in marriage and personal relationships. He was a patron of the arts, yet he faced scorn for failing to engage wholeheartedly with English customs. He was relatively successful in foreign policy, forging alliances and checking French influence, yet he never quelled the criticisms that he favored Hanover over England. He brought the House of Hanover to the British throne, ensuring a Protestant lineage, but he never won the hearts of his people the way a more charismatic monarch might have. And while critics in the newspapers of the day labeled him a German king who cared little for the people of Britain, it's equally possible to interpret him as a transitional figure. He bridged the old world and the new, the era of absolute monarchs and the rising tide of parliamentary power.